you to forget everything you think you know. I'm McLees, the alternative rebel, and you're listening to the Know Better, Do Better podcast, where we challenge health narratives from traditional myths to holistic truths that transform beliefs. Let's not waste another minute, so join me now. Welcome to the Know Better, Do Better podcast. I have really been looking forward to our interview here today because you are out there with your passion preaching incredible wisdom when it comes to terrain theory and living in this paradigm. And it is a paradigm that I am stepping into more and more all the time. I just got done binge watching for the last couple days, like so many of your videos, your incredible podcast, your guests. And so thank you for taking the time out to come on and talk with us here.
Of course, anytime. This is what I love. I love to talk about it. I could go all day.
I love it. Well, let's do this. So first of all, I'd love to start with like the heart of behind what you do. You know, how did you come to this place? What's your story, your background? Why do you have this passion? And then, of course, some people are already confused. What is the terrain perspective that we're talking about?
Okay. Yeah, so I started pretty conventionally. I did molecular biology and biochemistry in my undergraduate degree. I did end up finishing that degree, took many micro courses, virology. So I'm quite familiar with the consensus and the narrative and the processes, especially at the fundamental level. We've studied PCR in depth, X-ray crystallography, NMR as deep as it goes. So I'm not ignorant to what's going on in the laboratory, although I was very ignorant for the first part of my degree. I wanted to be a dental surgeon. That was my goal. I was on track. And then COVID hit. Had a lot of time to reflect. I also met my girlfriend, now wife. And that was a huge catalyst for me on my journey to pursue something more meaningful, full of longevity, full of purpose, sustainability. So I had a huge change of heart. I went and I did a master's in counseling psychology, opened up a therapy practice in Nova Scotia, now transitioning on to bigger and better things. Yeah, within the terrain paradigm. It's all within the terrain paradigm. So really that, and I'll get to that in a moment, but that transition for me, early COVID, I always remember I was fishing lobster commercially here at home. Quite a job. You wake up at 3 in the morning, you fish until about noon, some days 10, some days you're out till 4. And you get home and you're just exhausted. So I spent a lot of time researching because that's what I love to do. I was in second year going to third year, and I stumbled upon Dr. Kaufman's videos, Dr. Cowan, and I was of this mindset, conventional mindset. And I thought these guys are right off it. They're saying viruses don't cause disease and germs don't cause disease. And I went down and I never do this, like never. And I wrote a huge comment on Dr. Kaufman's video. And I was like, we know the molecular pathways of why germs cause disease. And it was just so funny now looking back. He comes back so calmly as he is, with a link to a video, and I watched it and I just went way down the rabbit hole. And not as though I subscribed to the COVID narrative right away, but I was certainly of the idea that viruses exist and they cause disease just as germs do. So that's really the crux of the terrain paradigm. Is it's true science, I like to say, true study of cause and effect. Many of the individuals in the terrain paradigm take a true Popperian standpoint of falsification. So we understand that empirically, when theories are falsified time and time again, it's time to reject a theory and move on. So reading thousands of contagion papers, you have no choice but to discredit the contagion theory, the germ theory, right? So people say it's germ theory versus terrain theory. Germ theory is certainly a theory. The terrain ideology doesn't really fall within the category of a theory because it's that our internal environment is a reflection of our external environment. That's really one of the fundamental principles. If there's toxicity and deficiency in your external environment, there will be toxicity and deficiency in your internal environment. It's just a reflection. It's almost a little bit of a mirror, and it also plays a little vice versa role as well. Our internal environment can certainly affect our external environment. We have a lot of power with our mind and our being and our energy and our intention. Yeah, so I hope that's clear to start us off there.
Yeah, super clear. I don't know why my mind always goes to like a fish tank. And when I try and explain to people like the terrain paradigm, it's kind of like, you know, you have a really ugly, foggy fish tank full of fungus and just debris floating around, right? And then you can have a really crystal clear fish tank. And so I don't know, that's kind of how I think of like the terrain of our bodies. Like the inside can be really beautiful, clear, well functioning. You got a good filter going, so everything's working properly. Or you can be putting junk in the water, or just letting, like, you can be stagnant and letting things manifest, and fungus and whatever bacteria or pleomorphism, which we'll get into, which is all new to me, like it starts to grow and take over, right? Is that like a somewhat decent example?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so it's the terrain is everything. And the germ, the microbes just respond to our terrain. Externally, internally, discussing it internally, when you have a diseased environment, which disease is caused by two fundamental categories, toxicity and deficiency, emotional, mental, spiritual, physical. When you have a diseased environment, biological organisms respond. They do not create the environment. So you say that microbes have detoxification and rejuvenation roles in the body. In the literature, they call it bioremediation or bioaccumulation. They have these big fancy words because these concepts are spoken of empirically in the literature, although the literature is quite polluted and a lot of it's full of nonsense and backfill. But these concepts are found in the literature. We know that microbes uptake toxicity, heavy metals, pharmaceuticals, pesticides, and they transform them or they help us get them out of the body. So our microbial systems work with our immune systems. Immune is really a misnomer, but they do work with our macrophages and phagocytes, our lymphatic system, and our skin, our excretory pathways, our gut, our sweat glands. These are ways that we can excrete and detox naturally, of course. We see this when it comes to colds and flus. You get a fever, you get GI symptoms, things are moving pretty quick, you're detoxing, you're getting things out. That is the body's natural detox mechanisms. Often we seek medicines when, sometimes we don't necessarily need them. We can just let our symptoms play the detoxification and rejuvenation roles because our bodies are brilliant. They know what to do. We just need to give it the right inputs, right? Be in the right external environment so that our internal environment resonates and reflects that positive, pure, natural external environment. So yeah, bacteria respond. You mentioned the concept of pleomorphism, which is probably the most interesting phenomenon I find in science. It's just that microbes change shape, function, and form in response to different environmental conditions. So, this has been observed for 100 years. Many scientists have discussed this. Even many of the modern scientists admit that microbes are pleomorphic. Helicobacter pylori is one that's takes on multiple shapes. It takes on multiple functions depending on what it's detoxing in your stomach. And so the idea of pleomorphism is that they change, microbes change, and they can change from a fungal state, from a bacterial state, and they can go into rods and cocci and different forms, and they have many different functions, which is critical to understand. The walls of microbial species aren't so clear cut as we try to make it out to seem. It's much more adaptive and responsive, and it's almost difficult to really encapsulate into fixed, kind of dead categories, right? So life is dynamic, it's ever changing. And so it's an amazing concept. And it just reflects life. We develop as humans, we develop from little babies into adults, and microbes are the same. They go through transitions and it depends on the environment, so
Right.
that's the fundamental there.
Yeah, I gotta say, I agree. Like, so some of the first concepts that I came into agreement on very easily that are not a major focus in mainstream conventional medicine, and that is that the body is made to heal, as I have a belief in God. And so I have that just, and we know, like, when I had a C-section with my first, went on to have a VBAC, by the way, because I learned better. But I had a C-section with my
Nice.
first. I didn't have to do anything for my C-section to heal. Like, my body knew what to do. So whether you are a believer or not in that sense, just is apparent, it's evident, it's undeniable. So our bodies are made to heal. Number 2 is that the body is detoxing when we're sick. But it took a minute to like wrap my head around viruses and like how those really aren't the case. And that took my own journey in walking this out for those that have heard that on other podcasts. But that's simply what the body is doing, is the diarrhea, the vomiting. So hopefully people can at least start off this episode with the agreement that whether we have been poisoned or we have, this huge toxin that we have come in contact with, it's in a large amount, and our body is ultimately protecting us. It's protecting us in doing what it was designed to do. So hopefully we can all start on that same page there. Next question for you is, what is the biggest misunderstanding about germ theory that the public still believes?
It's contagion. It's that diseases can spread from sick individuals to healthy individuals. It's just not the case. Thousands of control experiments falsify this idea when it comes to parasites, bacteria, so-called viruses, right? The first paper that I read were the Rosnow experiments, and this was 1918 when they did it, and they took 100 healthy volunteers from the army and put them in close contact with people who were sick with the Spanish flu. They exchanged quite literally fluids, mucus. They took swabs from diseased people to healthy people. They even tried to transfer it through the blood. They did every method possible, coughing on people, sneezing, breathing in the sick person's breath. They couldn't produce the disease. 0 out of 100 of the healthy individuals got sick. This is the norm when it comes to contagion experiments. You will read some contagion experiments where they do produce disease. And the only time that you can produce disease in healthy people is when you introduce unnatural exposure routes, which also contain confounding variables like toxicities. So taking something and injecting it into an animal or a person, that can cause disease because injections are unnatural. That is not a natural transmission route. Or the individuals are sick. So they'll take, a lot of studies now, they take immunocompromised mice, which are just mice who we give chemotherapy drugs to, and then we expose them to diseases, and then we go, oh, look, the disease, it got them. It's so funny. So like with polio, for example, and they did this with so many different diseases, meningitis, even parasitic diseases like amoebas. The way that they produced disease is they injected these organisms into the brains of monkeys and mice. So it's an absurd transmission route. The most sensitive, maybe arguably the most sensitive part of our body, they're injecting. And there's more than just the virus, so-called virus, or bacteria or parasite in these injections, in these inoculations. Often there's many uncontrolled variables. And it comes down to the toxicity again. So what's truly causing the disease is toxicity, which is unnatural synthetic substances or environments, which includes injections. Those are completely unnatural and they're synthetic and they're foreign. Or things that are natural in excess, but that kind of is outside the categories that we're discussing right now when it comes to the laboratory experiments. But contagion's the big one. You hear, and then, the first thing you say is, oh, well, Uncle, you know, Dave got sick, and then Aunt Kathy got sick too, because they're close to each other. Well, they're both living in a extremely toxic house. They eat out every single night of the week. They eat, McDonald's and Burger King, and they're both living the most unhealthy lifestyle that they can, and they're living the exact same lifestyle. So their bodies are going to detox at similar cycles. There's something to be said about, the bioenergetics at play. Do our bodies mimic each other? It's probably something that we've developed and adapted to do. When one person gets sick, it probably means that other people need to get sick. But again, it's just not always the case. It's not as clear cut as this, because as many stories as there are of people, undergoing contagion or transmission, there are more stories of people not getting it, not getting the disease. Chickenpox parties. Very successful when everyone goes to the sick person's house because they're probably going to a sick house. Very unsuccessful when you bring the sick person to the healthy people, which is kind of an interesting thing. The environment comes into question there. And still transmission is just not a constant phenomenon, right? So it depends on the state of your internal environment. If you are toxic and deficient, you are so-called susceptible, but still transmission is still not an observed phenomenon. It's not like we're passing bugs back and forth that are causing disease. It always depends on the internal environment. The literature supports this, anecdotal evidence supports this, logic supports this. It's really something that needs to be completely left behind.
Yeah, and as you said, there is the scientific studies. I think with the Spanish flu, that was a study, was it? Yeah, they're out there. I know that. I had Barbara O'Neill on the podcast, and she was referencing the concept of can you catch a cold, and she was talking about a study where they put them out in the cold and then in a warm bath and then put, the snot in somebody. And so she's like, no. But as far as the like energetic aspect of it, as I kind of imagine it, so a yawn is and can be contagious, right? But that's not a yawn germ or virus floating over to you or me. It's just something energetically there that is exchanged. We don't know why. Nobody studies that. And then women that often live under the same roof can menstruate together and their cycles can sync up, right? And so there's something there that, yeah, just there's a component there that we can't explain. So, you know, if our nature sheds its leaves from the trees and kind of does a cleansing with the seasons, right? Or shifts take place. So why wouldn't our bodies be designed to cleanse every so often? And then if that energetic component is there and, we have a spouse, what if once our bodies start cleansing, the spouse's body, its intelligent design says, you know what? That's a good idea. Let's start cleansing too, because we need a clean house. So to me, that just makes total sense and, completely throws out all of this germ viral nonsense.
Well, interesting too is, and it's sort of anecdotal, and I don't have empiricism to back this up, but spouses don't often get sick at the same time, which I think is again part of this beautiful natural design that comes from faith. But of course, that's an amazing thing that I can take care of the family while my wife is recovering and rejuvenating and detoxing. And then, when she's better, then it's my turn. You know,
That is
very
true
like
because it's not often that we have actually come down with it at the same time. It's like he's on
same
his way
time.
out and then I'm starting.
It's always staggered. It's so
Yeah.
interesting. Now, kids, on the other hand, they'll probably all get sick at the same time, but I don't know. Like, I got a little one on the way here due in September, but when I got lots of kids, I'd rather them all be sick at the same time rather than staggered, because it could just be sick house for a week. We can detox, we can rejuvenate, and then we're back to regularly scheduled program here.
Well, okay, so quickly then, I think we kind of know the gist of this, but why did this whole terrain perspective of health get suppressed in favor or get suppressed and then germ theory took the lead? Obviously, we know I call it the medical monopoly, but how would you speak to that?
Yeah, what a deep question. We did a webinar last night actually on the history of the terrain versus the germ, and it goes quite deep, and it really goes back to two people, Antoine Béchamp and Louis Pasteur. So Louis Pasteur, well known, the Pasteur Institute, pasteurization, all comes from Louis Pasteur, accredited with disproving spontaneous generation, experiments on fermentation, silkworm industry he supposedly saved, but he actually, almost drove it into the ground. He was an admitted plagiarist and a fraud, and it's very clearly documented in the Annales de Chimie. Antoine Béchamp did most of Pasteur's work years before Pasteur did it, and Pasteur plagiarized his work, claimed it as his own, and gained notoriety for it because he was a, quote, mediocre chemist and a phenomenal politician. We could get into conspiracies. Pasteur
I
had
heard he was like
connections
part of
with,
the elite government kind of thing, right? More
yes,
or less, he was kind of pushed
admitted
out there.
connections. Yeah, admitted connections with the Emperor of France at the time. A lot of money involved. He was a politician. Like, there's no doubt about it. He was He was a politician. He was the face of things. And when you go back and you read the original papers, Pasteur's papers versus Antoine Béchamp's papers, Antoine Béchamp is a very technical, scientific man. I actually have his book here, La théorie du microclimat and the système microbien. So the microbial system and his microzyma theory. And his books are very in depth and they're very complicated, technical, scientific, but it's based on experimentation. Louis Pasteur did no such thing. His experiments were enough to get him the fame that he needed to push his ideologies. This, went on for years. There's a good 20-year history of the feud between the Pasteur camp and the Béchamp camp, letters exchanged back and forth. I was reading a few this morning in the archives. This was the 60s era. And it just, you know, Pasteur Institute gained notoriety as well. Get the Rockefellers involved. It just sort of all evolved from there. You had the Flexner Report. That really changed the way science and curriculums were being used and practiced. It standardized education across North America, removed all the small universities of homeopathy, natural medicine, true naturopathy, just standardized the medical documents, increased the need for funding. So medical universities needed increased funding based on the new structure. So they had to rely on the funding of the Rockefeller Institutes and the donations from the Rockefellers. And if you didn't implement that curriculum, your university would get shut down. I'm pretty sure they went from like 800 universities in North America to 100 in a year. They had like there was this journal that was like to catch quacks. So they like tried to shut down all the natural medicine, and it's just so funny the history. But it goes deep. Vested interests are the biggest problem. Rockefeller, Carnegie, they had the money, they monopolized medicine. All medicine is made out of petroleum derivatives. Rockefeller, that's oil. He's got oil. And Carnegie had the steel. He had the railroads to bring it across North America. And they had the money. It was all done. I mean, it was all tax write-offs, and they used that to their advantage for sure. They funded their entire monopoly and it was all written off. They didn't pay a cent in taxes on it. Yeah, it goes deep, but it all really stems from Pasteur versus Béchamp. And there are few who have carried on the tradition. Gunther Enderlein, Gaston Naessens, Wilhelm Reich, Royal Reich. These are, more well known now, but they carried on the terrain tradition. But again, most of them underwent, losing their medical licenses, practicing medicine without a license. Dr. Bear-Paul Landau actually studied with Gaston Naessens in Montreal, which is kind of interesting. So he's really carrying on the torch as well, and I've learned a lot from him. And I know he's influenced a lot of people in the field. He's been in the field, Dr. Landau, for a good 40 years. So he's a big authority on this. But yeah,
But
it goes
now it's
deep. It
all
goes back
just
to,
now it's all just so big. These small people that have carried it on, I mean, they're either shut up, which we know that from like the cancer industry, there's been some, doing away with, to say it nicely, with certain practitioners that have, been helping people overcome. And so yeah, it's just there's no chance. It's too big of a giant. So you have to decide at this point.
yeah, yeah. It depends on the system you want to take part in, I guess. And, the biggest thing for me between terrain and germ or, modern academia is the terrain is about life. That was the major difference between how the terrain, people throughout history studied microbes and the body. They studied it as live as they possibly could. Whereas, modern academia and the germ theory was all about death science. It was all about dead things, dead anatomy, dead microbes. Electron microscopy, everything needs to be dead. Most of microscopy, everything is dead, stained with, heavy metals, and you're altering the tissues. It's not scientific whatsoever because it goes uncontrolled. But the terrain, theorists, for lack of a better term, they used dark field microscopes. They studied blood in the live state. They studied tissues as live as they could, as fresh as they could. They would cut it out of a cactus and they would study it right away, and you could see the microzyma. You could see the development of microbes, the changing nature of things as things broke down, as you added things to the sample. There's a very big difference in how things were studied. It's a choice between, health and disease in my eyes. It's life and death. One focuses on life, one focuses on death, one focuses on nature, one focuses on synthetic. That's sort of the big difference. So you're absolutely right. It's sort of a decision, and it comes from within, right? So what you see is you don't see too many atheists in the terrain tradition. You have to really have some sort of faith and understanding of natural design and the beauty of our realm too. So that's an important phenomenon. In modern academia, it's riddled with atheists, and it's a godless science. Absolutely is. It's godless, and so it's your choice, right? You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, and beautiful job at that explanation of the life and death, because that's really what it is. And when I had Dr. Sam Bailey on, she was like, it's pro-life, it's pro-life. And I didn't quite grasp it as much at the time. That was about a year ago. But now I'm seeing that more, and your example of that was beautiful. So you just made the perfect segue into our next question, which I want to get into PCR tests. And it's so cool that you have a background in this and, now an expertise. So during COVID, I kept hearing this narrative of like, there is no isolated virus. There is no isolated virus. And yet people were going and getting these PCR tests. And then I would hear, oh, well, they're just increasing the amplification of it. And so they're causing things to appear. But no, it's way more than that going on. And what I started to finally start to grasp what is somewhat happening was with uh, my own situation here with supposable hepatitis C, as they want to say, which does not exist. But what they do is they essentially take my blood, and it maybe not exactly in this order of events, but this is more or less the gist of it. Take my blood, starve it, put some dyes in there, put some antibiotics, and see, I might be missing a couple steps, but basically see how it manifests. And if it manifests a certain way, then I magically have a virus. And I thought viral isolation was you get your blood or your saliva or whatever. If you have a virus in you, it's going to be everywhere, right? More or less. You get it, you put it under a microscope because that's supposedly the only microscope that can see particles as small as viruses. Yet, how interesting that the electron microscope was invented after the discovery of viruses. So, okay. But anyway, I thought they were looking for like an actual virus, like those little pokey things on pictures, and they were going to somehow identify this strand that I had within me. They don't do such a thing. It's a total joke. They find nothing. And so that's our science, folks, but I'll let you take it away from there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think the real important point is that virology and the use of PCR, genomics, serology, which is the use of antibodies, which is very common to diagnose people, electron microscopy. This is really the crux, even cell culture, as you were alluding to there as well. These are the crux of virology, kind of the four horsemen of virology, as I like to put it. The big concept to understand is circular reasoning. So, circular reasoning is when the conclusion affirms the premise. So, you end up in your argument, you have one big, train of logic that never ends because when you get to the conclusion, it basically just proves the premise true. So, you never have a foundation. Our premise should be this fundamental starting point that's irrefutable, that reflects reality, and then you come to a conclusion at the end, which is sort of a logical deduction. When it comes to the use of genomics, of PCR, of electron microscopy, of cell culture, you engage in a big circular reasoning because PCR requires, for validation, antibodies, electron microscopy, and cell culture. And to validate the antibodies, you need PCR, cell culture, and electron microscopy. And to validate electron microscopy, which is admitted because viruses and viral like particles are indistinguishable under the electron microscope, you need to test it with PCR or serology or a cell culture to validate it. And you can see how everything just self validates and there's no starting point. So that's really the fundamental concept to understand when it comes to virology. And there engages two smaller circular reasonings within, even with the PCR. Like you mentioned, there's never been the isolated genome of a virus. How do we know what the sequence is in the first place to be able to validate it with PCR, which is created based on the sequence that we've never validated. So we're validating the sequence that validates the PCR test, that validates the sequence, that validates the PCR test. So you can see it's impossible to kind of escape this circle. And then it just gets bigger with the other methods that we add in. Interestingly enough, with electron microscopy, I urge you, like the listener, to go look up, electron microscopy of lung cancer. And what you'll find is that there are tons of viruses or viral-like particles in lung cancer patients. So when they take samples from someone who has lung cancer, you could see that there is a huge breakdown of tissue going on. And to the naked eye, it's indistinguishable with viruses, right? So how do they determine that it's not a virus and that it's lung cancer? Well, they test it with PCR and they test it with antibodies and they test it with a cell culture, right? Cell culture has been falsified. When you run a cell culture without virus, it still produces viral-like particles and cell death because you actually have to starve the cell culture to produce particles, to produce viruses, supposedly. So when you starve a healthy cell culture, you produce cytopathic effects, you produce cell death, you produce so-called viruses without actually adding any virus to the sample. Falsified. So the method is completely faulty. We touched on electron microscopy. Antibodies falsely are said to be specific. They're non-specific. Again, the empirical literature shows this. There are many examples that show that antibodies bind and cross-react to different targets. The tests are the most unreliable thing in science. Admittedly, once again, the reproducibility crisis in biomedical literature is a huge problem. Some scientists themselves, those who are doing the science, say that upwards of 95% of papers are irreproducible, which is the cornerstone of science. You cannot reproduce the results using the same method because they rely on antibodies. And antibodies produce varying, almost random results. And so how do they get the results that they desire? They run the experiments as many times as they need to get the results that they want. And the same is for PCR. Really, what we're seeing is non-specific answers. And it lies in the way that we set up these machines. So, of course, we could talk about the amount of cycles that something is undergoing. And yes, that does increase the positive rate of the test when you're running it at 45 cycles versus 35 cycles. But it actually goes far beyond that, and this is something that really gets lost. Something that you do when you run a PCR test is you have to calibrate the machine. And so when you calibrate it, you have to decide subjectively as the scientist what is noise and what is not noise. And so
Like
noise,
literally, what is noise? Or what?
it's noise in the data. Sorry. So I know
Okay.
this is
Okay.
maybe getting a little bit
Yeah, because
technical, but kind of I appreciate that.
yeah.
Noise, I know I can kind of go down and get a little technical there. But noise as in sort of when you see PCR, the lines go up and that's your data. And when the line goes up and it goes past a certain threshold, it's positive. And so the noise is kind of lines going up that aren't actually the positive result. And you decide what that is as the scientist because, it's just opinion. It's subjective is the point. We could get into the technicalities of everything, but the point is that it's completely subjective. And the way that these tests are set up, they decide whether or not you get positive or negative results. Right. And this is something that's skipped over completely as being, they don't even talk about it in papers because it's the standards of practice, which is just nonsense. It's uncontrolled. None of it goes controlled. Many of the statements are unfalsifiable, which are unscientific, according to Karl Popper, the king of empiricism. So it's just a big, big problem. Circular reasoning is what you got to come back to. Where is the foundation and what is the conclusion? And if the foundation and the conclusion are the same, circular reasoning.
Yeah, I've experienced this a little bit as I have kind of sorted through the science when it comes to my stuff. And one of the things that's part of their circular reasoning that just doesn't make any sense is, okay, so the first doctor said, so I think you've had this for about 2 or 3 years based on your viral numbers. So that was my very first doctor giving me feedback. So I'm like, okay. So then I learned, the virus replicates. Okay. Next test I got, the viral load had like jumped up. Then I was doing some holistic modalities. I did something called Bowen therapy. And I went and got a test after, and whoa, my viral load went way down. And then just throughout the year, whether I was doing things or not, literally for these last couple years, the viral load is up and down all over the place. It goes up and down. So I asked a doctor once and I'm like, so I thought this virus is like supposed to be replicating and like it gets so high and then that's concerning. And then gives me some little BS answer of like, oh, well, that's your immune system. If it's, working well, then it decreases. And I'm just like, no, it
Pretty
either
cop out.
replicates or it doesn't. Like, and then the other thing was antibodies. With HIV, if you have active, like you are considered active virus HIV. If you have antibodies with hepatitis C, you have just been exposed. It does not mean you have active hepatitis C. So we're not even functioning from an overarching definition from what it all should be. It's like it gets to change, and then they just change it depending on what you have. And then I also found out you can test positive for HIV here in the US and test negative in another country. How's that for somebody throwing their, world upside down? So this is crazy nonsense. And I can't believe how do doctors, like, I mean, you were in the midst of it, right? You started off on this path. How do you not see this? Like, how did you not
Mm,
see it and now you see it?
yeah. Well, one thing, if you don't want to see it, you don't pick your head up and you just keep your head in the test tube. That's probably the most important thing that you can do if you don't want to see. Keep your head down. The second you look up and you look around, you're like, holy shit, this is all nonsense. And you highlighted beautifully there kind of the stories told, right? And that it's stories is different than what we see in the literature. You can scour the literature. I don't care. You could read millions of papers. You'll not find a single suggested number to what a viral load is. I don't even know how to define viral load. It's how many viruses you have in your body. There's not a number out there. There's nothing. These are stories told to people, and there's a disconnect between the practice and the empirical literature. And listen, there's a time and a place for symptom suppression and for pharmaceutical intervention in emergency situations. But the reality is that 99.9% of the time, the stories that are being told are still false. Whether it's we have to cut off your immune system because your immune system's fighting a virus or whatever. It's like you're cutting off the symptoms, that's for sure. But the story that's told behind it is nonsense. It's fairy tale. It's la la land. It doesn't exist. It really doesn't. Like you're mentioning, the antibodies. What does an antibody mean? Well, it depends on where you are in the world and who you're talking to and what supposed disease symptoms you have and who you've been exposed to and what kind of positive PCR test we can get you on today. So it's just stories.
Hmm. Yeah. And to that, they say if I can get my viral load down to 15,000, then I'm normal. And I'm like, wouldn't zero be normal? Like, wouldn't that just make common sense? Like, not like 15,000. So anyway,
I'm really
it's
surprised they gave you a number actually, because there is not a number in the literature, which is really interesting. They gave you a number. I'm kind of surprised to hear that. Yeah,
like, surprised, not surprised, right? All right. What
fair.
are the red flags people should look for when it comes to medical diagnostics and data? Can we look at blood work? I mean, obviously, maybe not viruses, like the basic metabolic labs, as they call them, I think. Is it worth getting blood work once a year? Is there really something to see that can be helpful?
Yeah, I'll discuss this outside of emergency situations.
Hmm. Yeah, because I think
That
we
kind
all
of
can agree, like, the
necessitates.
hospital has a
Yeah,
time and place, right? Like, we're not going to
yeah,
just die on the side of the road. We'll go to the hospital.
exactly. Yeah. But outside of, you know, emergency situations, I think the biggest red flag is the asymptomatic carrier. You feel fine, you look fine, you're doing fine, life is good, you get up in the morning, you go to bed at night, your energies are fine, but you have this test that's off, that's abnormal, or some sort of biomarker is elevated or too low, you know, but you feel fine. What's really wrong? We kind of ignore reality. Like life is good, but I have a test that's not good, so I'm not good. Why are we doing that to ourselves? Why are we doing that to ourselves? If you're healthy, you feel good, you're connected spiritually, your mind feels good, you wake up in the morning with energy, you go to bed and you're a little sleepy because you did something during the day. There's no reason. There's absolutely no reason. Acutely, you get sick, we don't need tests. You're sick with a strep throat or whatever they want to call it. Why we got to go to get a swab and get an antibiotic? Just leave it. Even in Europe, they don't do that. They think that American doctors are crazy for how much they prescribe antibiotics. Even the European medically trained doctors. I have many doctors in my life, I talk to on a daily basis. Some of them have went to medical school in Europe. They think it's insane how much we prescribe things. They're like, we know it's strep. It looks like strep. You have sore throat. It's red. There's some white stuff in there. Let it run its course. You don't need an intervention constantly. You don't need tests. You don't need blood work or whatever. Chronic conditions, it's always going to be a big, it depends. The way I approach it, we can simply address the fundamentals. If you're eating McDonald's every day and you have a chronic disease and you don't move your body and you're working a job that you hate and you're, living an unfulfilled life, I suggest that you just change your habits. You don't necessarily need blood work right away. Blood work really only serves pharmaceutical allopathic interests. It doesn't really serve a terrain approach. That being said, there are interesting modalities, the study of the blood, like holographic blood, like the Bigelsons do from a very terrain aligned perspective. Is it used for diagnostics? In a way, it is. Dr. Harvey Bigelson is a great, he passed now, but he was a great doctor, and he looked at people's blood and he could tell exactly what was wrong with them right away just by looking at a drop of their blood. And he was able to help people. But I think it begs the question of what's being done to help people. Dr. Harvey Bigelson didn't give people pharmaceutical drugs if they had something off in their blood. He addressed the terrain, the lifestyle factors, the habits, and honestly, like my philosophy is let's change your lifestyle completely first and align it with nature. And if you're stuck, you know, I would probably look at trauma and energy and our psychology, and then I would go to the biochemistry. That's the way that I would look at it. Change your lifestyle, give it a good honest go, be strict with yourself, don't lie to yourself and tell yourself you're doing good, but you're eating ice cream every day. I love ice cream. I eat probably too much ice cream, but that's fine. I cope with that. But you know what I mean? Like, you got to address the lifestyle first and then move in, maybe study the mind, look into the mind factors, because then our mind plays very interesting roles in chronic conditions too, where you start over identifying with your condition and you're like, yeah, I am this person. I have this. So that's who I am, and I'm not going to let that go. Like, I am a cancer patient, and I will be until I die of this cancer, which I'm told I'm going to die in 4 months. Again, I'll bring up Dr. Harvey Bigelson. Healed so many people from cancer. His sons, I chat with his sons quite often. His sons say this story about him that he ran a retreat and it was like a month retreat and he healed this woman of cancer. She didn't have cancer anymore. You know, when she left the retreat, she goes, "Okay, so when do I come back?" And he goes, "You don't need to come back. You're healed. You're fine. You don't have cancer." She goes, "No, but like I'm a cancer patient. Like I need to get it checked up. Like I need to get a checkup. I need to come back." And it was this mentality that was keeping her stuck. And he goes, "No, no, you got to go and find your life purpose. You got to go find what your hobbies are and what you love to do and what your interests are because you're not a cancer patient anymore. You need to reframe your identity. You need to have that narrative shift." So I worked in mental health professionally. That narrative shift is probably the most powerful thing that you can do. And it's one of the most difficult. There's no doubt about it. But that's where I approach it. And blood chemistry can be a tool. It can keep you stuck. It can keep you stuck in this mindset. The blood is dynamic. It's changing constantly, depending on the day, depending on where you are in your cycle. For the feminine, it's so many. There's so many factors going on, and it's a snapshot. It's a snapshot. It's part of the kind of the death science. It doesn't really reflect reality. You know, keep stuck. Keep you stuck. Can be useful. Can keep you really stuck. I say adjust the lifestyle. Address the terrain. What you got to do.
Yeah, beautifully said. And now you got me thinking about, you're right on the blood work. Well, I've heard that the range of what's normal can vary from either state to state or county to county or something. Like it's like based on how healthy that population. So like the deep south has a different range of what's healthy than, maybe a ritzier northern part of a state, and so then that's problematic. Like what? Like, so why we're looking at this science or these tests, this is where I'm at. I feel like we're looking at them as though this is God. Like if God says if you don't fall within this range, you're 2 points over, you are unhealthy and you're a stressed basket case. And I'm just like, wow, we have really just gotten way out of hand here. In the white coats are just like gods. And so I'm really thankful to be in this place of waking up and to not put my whole life in the basket of this medical monopoly system, because they do not have it all figured out. I would say quite the opposite. They have nothing figured out other than
Yeah,
maybe emergency medicine.
fair. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then the concept of self-fulfilling prophecy comes up for me right now. It's you're told you have 4 months to live. How are you gonna live your life? Some people, they go and they buy a convertible and they drive down the coast and then they never die, because they changed their lifestyle and they live large and they just said, you know what, screw this. I'm just gonna live my dream. And some people, they lay down and they die. It's kind of, again, it's the decision that you make, so
Well, you touched on, I think this will be a good segue. You kind of touched on strep throat, and I want to touch on pleomorphism, if I'm saying that right. I know that's a deep subject, but as I have now learned, strep throat is essentially the body's design. It's a cleanup crew for something that is, taking place in the back of the throat, whether it's poison or you've breathed in something or toxin or whatever. So essentially, you can have strep. It's kind of like the firemen showing up at the fire. You are claiming the firemen started the fire, and really, no, there's the cleanup through. Same with the strep bacteria. Correct me if I'm wrong, they are there as the cleanup crew. And so yeah, there's soreness because your body's healing. So does that fit into a segue into pleomorphism?
yeah. Any sort of pathogen does, right? And so strep is kind of a great example of sort of the train paradigm. As you mentioned, firefighters don't cause fires, but they're always at the site of disease. I used to think that there had to be some sort of infraction in the throat for there to be a disease response, but the tonsils are a detoxification powerhouse, an immune, part of the immune system, which is a misnomer, but we know that it's a detoxification powerhouse. What happens when you get your tonsils removed? You never get strep throat again. So you remove the root of that detoxification pathway. A huge part of our detoxification pathway is dumping toxicity into our GI tract, which is an external system. It interfaces with the external world. If you think about it, that's what we were always taught. It's a method of excretion, right? So we dump toxins into our mouth. If you wake up and your breath really stinks and your mouth tastes like shit, it's time to do something about that. You can help that process along. Oil pulling, coconut oil can be really good to get that out. Same with the GI, having a great bowel movement in the morning is one of the best things you can do. Detox that GI tract. I know Agenus Vonderplanet spoke of doing cheese trains to bind toxins, different methods, zeolites. Cheese trains. He would eat raw, unsalted cheese. Yeah, so you'd eat raw unsalted cheese at like 30-minute intervals, and it would bind the toxins in the gut. So raw dairy, unsalted, does it very well, binds toxicity. It's a great chelator. Depending on where you are in your healing journey, it sort of depends, right? Some people tolerate it. Raw is always best, though. That's my philosophy for sure. Segueing into pleomorphism, streptococcus is part of the pleomorphic process. All pathogens are. Parasites might be outside of this slightly. They still undergo very similar development from ova, from eggs, and they develop. But talking about bacteria, fungus, these are sort of in the same pleomorphic cycle. I don't think that parasites are necessarily on the complete outside of this, but based on some of the empirical literature, it seems that way. But that's kind of a different discussion. Um, yeah, pleomorphism. It's the body, it's the adaptation of our microbial system from the microzyma. It is this guy's work. Antoine Béchamp. Start with these little bodies, microzyma. They have many different names over the years as different scientists study them, call them bions, somatids, protists. I stick with microzyma because shout out to Antoine Béchamp, guy who started it all. Essentially, from these little tiny particles, they undergo Brownian motion. You can only see them through dark field microscopy in live tissue. They're only observed in natural substances. They're ubiquitous around the world. They're in chalk, they're in cactus, they're in all of our bodies, all of our fluids. Every single area of our body contains these microzymas. These microzymas develop, they grow, they become bigger, they take on different shapes, rods, cocci, they take on fungal shapes. And so it's just the development of biological organisms in response to an environment and a diseased environment at that, right? So as toxicity increases in the system, we need to increase our response. So if you have a little kitchen fire, you only need one fire truck there. But if the whole house is burning and there's a forest fire, you need a big response. So a big response is parasites and fungus because these can bioaccumulate and chelate toxicity at very high concentrations, much higher than our tissues can. So they can store toxicity to relieve our tissues so that our tissues can continue working. Another sort of method of detoxification, some people eat moldy berries. You get pretty intense detox reactions, but by intentionally consuming mold, yeah, pretty intense. Definitely not advice here or anything, but again, it's kind of one of Agnes von der Planet's theories. Again, kind of along the line of Agenus, high meat, fermented liver, fermented meat, fermented cod liver. These are great detoxification things to consume.
Wait, so
You
but
got to go low and
explain
slow.
explain the moldy
Yeah,
berries. I've not
yeah.
heard of that. So how does that, so in other words, you're giving your body a toxin. Is it kind of
Mm,
up upriver of like a homeopathic effect? Like you're giving your body a toxin or a mold to kind of rev up its detoxification systems to then purge and force out all that needs to come out kind of thing.
yeah, yeah. So this might segue into a part two discussion for us, but mold, I don't think causes disease in any capacity. It's not the mold, so it's not actually introducing a toxicity. I would say it's introducing the biological organism that's cleaning up a toxicity. So a natural kind of molding of the berry is introducing a fungus to the body, yes, to do that exactly that, to kind of aid this pleomorphic cycle, to do the role of cleaning up that dead, dying, toxic environment. So it's a little bit along the lines of kind of that homeopathic remedy, but the mold itself, the fungus, is not actually a toxin. That's kind of that perspective shift a little bit there. Same goes for the fermented meats, high meat. Native Americans did this. They would consume meat that was left out in the ground for a month, 2 months until it was absolutely putrid. If you couldn't smell it from down the river, it wasn't ready. And it was basically, yes, introducing an intense number of biological organisms, fungus, parasites, bacteria into our system to really clean it out. So yeah, super detoxing can be quite heavy. And again, it really does depend on where you are on your healing cycle. Is this something that everyone should do? Probably not. Is it something that everyone needs? Probably not. But some people could benefit greatly from this stuff too, right? And it's it's as natural as it gets. It's really harnessing this idea of pleomorphism, of organisms developing in our body to fight off and detoxify and rejuvenate any sort of toxicity and deficiency. So you're just kind of helping that process along. And that's the train mindset. It's aiding your symptoms, supporting your systems, building strength, resilience, not suppressing. You don't want to
Hmm.
suppress your symptoms at all.
Beautiful way to conclude here. And I gotta say, that whole ending part with the berries and all that stuff, that's a new concept for me, but yet it kind of links up with, I had a friend that was reading a book, something along the lines of like eating dirt or let them eat dirt, your kids or something. And it had to do with, we live in harmony with all microorganisms. And, I know parasites have, you're never going to get rid of parasites. So we have some, right? And they eat up heavy metals. And so we live in like a harmony essentially, right? With microorganisms. And so it sounds like it's just a deeper dive into the expansion of that knowledge of how it's okay to actually live in harmony with all these things. And maybe we were meant to. So, well, if you have anything else to correct me on that, let me know. But as we get ready to wrap this up, I want to ask, what would be your 3 top tips to empower our listeners as far as your wisdom?
Nature is the answer to all of our problems. We've created all of our problems. Getting back to nature is always the answer. When you look around your bedroom and your house, how can you implement more nature into your environment? How can you get out of your house more to be in nature a little bit more? Getting your feet in the ground, sunlight, natural whole foods. Those are the way. It's getting back to nature. I like to reduce disease to the absence of light and distance from the creator. That is absolutely the true fundamental cause of disease. We have disconnected from nature, from God's creation, and this has caused all of our problems. Civilizations throughout history have collapsed due to diseases, and sometimes they call them plagues and whatever. It's civilization that's the problem. So that's tip number 1, get back to nature. Tip number 2, take responsibility for your health. No one can heal you. No one can save you. No one can give you a magic bullet. No one can do the great work. Only you can do the great work. You can work with people. People can walk alongside you, for parts of your journey. But it is your responsibility. Take responsibility for you and your family's health. Your spouse, you have less control over. They need to take responsibility, but your children, that's your responsibility until they get to a certain age, of course. And trying to instill that responsibility into them as well is very important. I think that's all I got. 2 tips for you.
Cool. Yeah. And where can people find you? Liev, where can they connect with you? You have your podcast, you're over on Instagram doing your thing. So where are all the places they can connect?
Yeah. Beyond.terrain on Instagram, Beyond Terrain on YouTube. The podcast is called Beyond Terrain. Lots of amazing content there, hours and hours and hours of content to go through. I have launched the Beyond Terrain Academy. It is free to join, so there's tons of free resources in there too. There are paid membership options as well to go a little bit deeper, but inside the free membership, there is an introductory course on the root causes of disease, toxicities, deficiencies, traumas, and there's a section on the fundamentals of the terrain, which kind of go over the fundamental logical foundations and the axioms of the terrain paradigm, more from the logical standpoint, the rationalism standpoint, not so much the empirical standpoint, but there certainly is there are lots of empirical resources over there as well. So go check that out. It's free to join, so there's lots of cool resources there, and that'd be greatly appreciated. Lots of resources everywhere. If you find me anywhere and everywhere. So
I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I could keep going and make this a 2-part series, but we'll have to have you back. Appreciate you giving of your time, your wisdom, and just everything you say is, I would say, easily digestible. There's some people out there that are a little bit more academic in their speech. And while you're very well spoken, don't get me wrong, you put it in such a way that it's easier for us to understand. So I really appreciate your mission and cheering you on.
I appreciate your kind words. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. And we will see y'all next time, same place. Bye for now. Thanks for joining The Revolution, where we urge you to not just listen, but act. Make sure to hit the follow button to never miss an episode, subscribe to the weekly newsletter below, and fuel this podcast's growth by rating, reviewing, and blasting this episode across your network. Knowledge is power, but only if you implement it. Until next time.